The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 14.
During their 8 months away up north, Dan and Thon had both become hardened, experienced giant killers. Their exposure to some of the world's best in action gave them tremendous insights on how to organize their raiding parties and wipe out the giants and the horde that followed them with the highest of efficacy. The Tonderlands were wild and harsh and filled with danger. The men of Ivan's kingdom were fearless to a fault. Before their encounter at the jagged cliffs, they had never dreamt giants of such massive size could exist. Now they had seen them in the flesh, if flesh they even had. As they were nearing the end of a 6-week voyage to Torbana, thoughts of home returned.
I haven't heard any message from Fergus in quite some time.
Thon told Dan.
He usually calls on us more regularly. I have heard nothing for months.
Thon showed concern. Dan reflected on his recent spate of dreams involving the Great Seer.
I have seen him. In dreams,
Dan said.
Tell me what you've seen.
I was in a dark, endless cavern. I was lost, and he arrived with a torch. He led me out of the cave until we reached the end. I could see the valley, the bright light of day filling it. He then told me to go back into the darkness.
Dan remembered as their ship smacked down upon another powerful wave of the Western Ocean.
I remember thinking it was strange for him to send me back after leading me out.
That is strange. What was in the cavern?
Thon asked. He was curious to know the details. To humans, particularly the members of the Sacred Fire, dreams bore enormous significance. They were the language of the gods.
I couldn't see. I just remember being lost and alone.
Dan exposed a rare moment of human frailty.
He must have a mission for you.
Thon smiled.
You can ask him when you see him. We're nearly there.
When Ivan's fleet reached Torbana the following week, all the remaining ships of his fleet were gathered. 52 ships of all sizes had made the journey successfully. 2 were lost at the jagged cliffs. Another was reportedly lost to a giant sea monster. This was the largest collection of ships ever assembled by any monarch of the Tonderlands, the fabled birthplace of humanity. But to King Ivan's disappointment, there was no greeting party of ships from Torbana to meet them. The great western city and its once vibrant port were still smoldering from ongoing chaos and invasion. Ivan waited patiently on board his flagship until a large bird approached overhead. It circled the boat. As its feet landed on the wooden deck, it had transformed back into his mage, Fearin.
What news?
Asked Ivan.
The city's been sacked. It smolders, and the people within all suffer. The regent has been assassinated, but evidently men of the Order were here and recovered his body. They fought off a western invader, a cultist, only to abandon the city days later. It's an ugly, lawless place, my liege.
It is exactly as we left it last year.
Thon warned. He looked to Dan and his expression bespoke uncertainty.
They should have retaken the city by now. Well then, let's go lay down some law,
said Ivan, seeing opportunity. Ivan chose his landing party of about 120 men, which included Dan and Thon, who after weeks at sea were eager to get off the ship and back on dry land. Thon pressed Fearin about the location of his comrades, but there was little credible information to go by. The freedom they had enjoyed on their mission with the Tondermen over the last 8 months was now replaced by intense feelings of guilt and remorse. Perhaps they had enjoyed themselves a bit too much and stayed away a bit too long.
We should have been here,
said Dan to Thon as they approached the smoldering port by the shore. Thon nodded. They both expected the worst. Ivan wasted no time implementing his plan to wrest control of the city. The central wall and castle gate still stood, but its streets were now filled with the impoverished and controlled by competing gangs. The massive grain stores had all been sacked and sold off to the surrounding feudal lords. Mismanagement of the farms caused much of the crops of the many surrounding fields to spoil away. So most of the people who survived through the winter were now nearing starvation. Ivan's main battalions of fighting men moved within archers' range. Several of the others approached the castle walls, bearing the black and gold banners of the Tonderland king. The rabble of defenders that now manned the outer gate were convinced quite easily to open it, because the many gangs and their leaders were separated by interest. Ivan appealed to the only interest they had left here, their own survival. Neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, the inhabitants were given a simple choice: leave or die. Within a few days, Ivan and his men had gained total control of the castle, with very little killing done. As much as Ivan's battle tactics impressed Thon, the ranger was not impressed by his treatment of the many refugees. His men were hungry, horny, and anxious for plunder. The wretched people that filled the streets only filled them with contempt and offered little to satisfy those needs. Their harsh treatment of the remaining civilian populace became a point of contention as the streets were emptied and the people who made those streets home were forced out beyond the outer walls of the city.
It's a good thing it's us, and not Reg and Kiontan here. We'd certainly have a fight on our hands.
Thon told Dan, as they stood by, powerless to prevent the forceful evacuation of the helpless.
Agreed, but we cannot be party to this either. This isn't right. We need to find Fergus,
Dan said succinctly. Thon was impressed. Despite his hard warrior's exterior, Dan was still a man of deep empathy, with a profound respect for human dignity.
Everything of value has been taken from this place.
Yes.
There's no gold,
Yes.
no food stores, no animals to cull.
Yes.
And certainly not a drop of ale to be had.
Aye. What a filthy pit this place is.
Ivan's men complained. He shared in their disappointment, though they hadn't been promised a large castle, and that was something they did now have.
The spoils that we were promised shall be ours. When the owners of this place return, we'll demand it out of them.
Ivan said,
Previous owners.
yelled out one of his mighty lords.
Aye.
They all laughed.
That's right.
Dan and Thon then took opportunity to approach the king. Thon spoke first.
Your Grace, it seems your men will be secure here until reinforcements arrive. Dan and I should go and see what's keeping them. No need, Ranger. I've already dispatched my scouts in every direction.
Ivan said, downing the near last of the ale they had brought with them.
We should have word shortly.
King Ivan,
Spoke Dan with persuasiveness.
we believe our high priest may be in great danger. We need to locate him, and
So you're leaving?
Ivan frowned.
we must. But we shall return with allies.
More promises.
Scoffed Ivan.
Well, here we are. We've upheld our side of the bargain, haven't we?
Ivan stood up and then raised his
That's right.
voice, which brought attention to his every word for everyone in the wrecked hall to hear. His drunk and excited men responded with cheers and jeers at each word.
We were promised gold, land, and more giants to slay. But what do we find here? Vermin, a wrecked city, filthy streets, and empty coffers. And hideous women!
Another of his men yelled out, to the laughter of the others.
Yes, and not a scrap of food to eat. So now, Great Ranger, and you, Legend of Bishopsgate, now you decide you must leave us. Aye.
Ivan's eyes darted into Dan, his grizzled auburn beard glinting with stray beer droplets. Both Dan and Thon were speechless, but in the end, they were his guests, not his subjects or his prisoners. Ivan had no right to demand they stay.
Well, go then.
Jeers came from his dispirited lords, who had taken a liking to these two men of the South, despite their shortcomings. Thon looked to Ivan, and then back to Dan. Dan was about to speak when Ivan interrupted.
And you need horses, I presume.
The following morning, Dan and Thon fitted their borrowed horses, both of which were very thin, and had likely been within days of being eaten themselves by the starving populace.
Normally, I'd suggest we separate and cover more ground. But given we have no idea where anyone is, we'd really just be losing each other,
Said Thon.
Which way first?
Dan asked.
Well, we could head east and hope to link up with Ramthar's army. Last I heard, they were supposed to be heading this way, reinforcing us here.
Thon suggested. Dan listened, though his eyes were focused west.
Or we could head back towards Bishop, with the hopes of running into some of our friends, or enemies, who would likely have better information if we can get it out of them.
Dan looked back at Thon with some degree of disbelief.
You're the ranger, Thon. Which way do you feel the track leads?
Thon looked towards the westerly road.
Without a fresh trail, it's hard to say. But I can't imagine the day Fergus or his paladins would turn their backs on the face of evil.
Westward it is.
Dan agreed. As they mounted and started off away from the gates of the city, they could hear a group of riders approaching quickly behind them. A voice yelled out to them. It was King Ivan. He was speeding towards them on horseback. Several of his men followed closely behind. Dan and Thon had spent nearly a year with these men. They battled together. They shared much, and felt as though a brotherhood had been established. Certainly, they couldn't be after our heads, they wondered. But as the horses drew nearer, Ivan held his shieldmen back as he approached them alone.
By the gods! When you said you were leaving, I didn't know you meant right that very blasted minute. Was the party last night really that bad?
Ivan said sarcastically. Thon smiled at Dan, for it seemed the king had regained his humor.
Our apologies, Your Grace. We should have been clearer.
Thon began, but Ivan cut him off as he leapt from his horse.
There's something I had for the both of you. Something I wanted to give you. Something very special.
He smiled widely.
Sire, there's certainly no need for that. We couldn't possibly accept. You know, we are humble servants of the Order.
Thon tried to be polite, but Dan, always the cleverer spokesman, put out his hand to suggest they let Ivan offer whatever it was. Silence and acceptance were the best words to be chosen here. In a show of respect, they also dismounted so as not to ever look down on the Tonda King. Ivan had a long package held together with cloth and twine. He unlaced it from the saddle of his warhorse and pulled it down, revealing two sheathed longswords. Even from a distance, they could tell they were magnificent. Ivan stepped towards them proudly.
These are giant-slaying swords, only intended for true giant killers.
He said, pulling one of them from the scabbard. It had runes struck down its glistening blade of a long-lost northern dialect.
They were forged by our master smithies in the fires of the Kirk Mountains, hundreds of years ago, during the first Great Giant War. And they have been in my family for nearly a century. I wanted for you both to have them.
He handed them each one of the brilliant longswords. Each was an immensely finer weapon than any either of them had ever owned. Once again, Thon began to think of pleasantries for non-acceptance, but Dan beat him to the punch.
You honor us, great king. We shall use these swords as we conquer the giants in your honor.
As Dan spoke, Ivan smiled.
I could think of no better place for these blades to be than with you two. You have proven yourself worthy of possessing them. I feel you will put them to good use. Despite all those horrible traits that you southern men are said to have, well, they're not all entirely justified.
He laughed. They smiled back as they finally got the joke.
You both would make fine additions as lords of my realm, but you are men of honor, and you keep your word to those whom you offer it.
He nodded in sublime acceptance of their mission.
Go find your high priest, and inform him I am stationed here at Torbana, waiting, as he requested, until we meet again.
He extended his hand in a brotherly embrace for both of them. He then remounted his horse and made his way back to his men and the broken city they now held. Over the next few days, the two horsemen made their way through the stifling late summer heat. Then the rain finally came. It fell harder and harder until it became a deluge. As the rain poured down, the path became less clear, and the horses, already weakened by months of neglect, struggled through the mucky path. They needed rest desperately. The two dismounted and gave their horses what little left they had for them to eat.
We haven't much food left. We're still at least 3 days from Bishop's Gate.
Thon mentioned. Suddenly, through the mist of rain and fog, Dan noticed a mass of people making their way down the road. It was peculiar to see people walk without cover in such pouring rain.
Oh, look, a caravan. Perfect. Maybe they can offer us some food and information.
Dan said, pulling a pouch that contained a few gold and silver pieces. He looked down to it and started counting what he had. Thon stepped forward for a closer look.
Look like refugees, more likely.
Thon observed. The two remounted their horses and started down the road slowly. As they got closer, Thon noticed the strange movements of the group. They walked in staggered fits, without real regard for the muddy road.
This isn't good.
Thon offered. It was clear now that whatever they were on the road to meet was certainly not a caravan of merchants or refugees. They were a pack of wandering undead.
We can take them,
Dan said confidently.
Yes, but we don't know how many more lurk behind them.
Thon warned.
These horses aren't fit for running far. And who else besides us are fit to put these things to rest?
Dan retorted. With that, the two charged the wandering zombies and used speed of horse and their newly acquired longswords to lop off the heads and extended arms of the hissing undead. Fortunately, this was only a small congregation of about a dozen. They managed to drop them all rather quickly, but the horses were certainly spooked by the encounter. Dan and Thon shared a glance of foreboding. The situation was clearly worse than they had thought.
There's a village nearby, or was, a few miles to the southwest, just outside Milandin.
Dan remembered.
We could probably reach there by sundown, and maybe find some shelter.
Or an even bigger battle with these things.
Thon responded, but he agreed to Dan's plan.
Lead the way.
He smiled. Fortunately, the few undead they did encounter along the way were dropped easily or simply bypassed altogether. When they reached the village later that night, it was dark and quiet. The rain had stopped, which made the horses' steps glopping in the mud, the only noise they could hear. The small village seemed abandoned. They found a small farmhouse with a fireplace and some stored dry wood, and started to make camp. That's when Thon noticed a glowing orb making its way down the road towards them. As the floating orb got closer, they noticed it was an enormous eye, turning its sight from side to side as it bobbed and glowed in the night. They both retreated into the house, and soon after, they observed the glowing eye retreat into the woods from whence it came. Once again, the rain returned. This time, it was even harder.
What the hell was that?
Dan asked in a near whisper.
Looked like a giant floating eyeball. No teeth, though. I think it's spying magic.
Do you think it saw us?
Dan asked.
Hard to say. Well, so much for a good night's sleep on solid ground.
Thon huffed. About a minute went by before there was a knock on the door. They remained silent. Then another, more persistent knock followed. The two warriors approached slowly, positioning themselves on either side of the door, brandishing their new twin longswords.
Who goes?
Thon said in a vaguely adopted voice.
Well, open the door already. It's pouring out here,
said Khan. Dan and Thon's eyes met with a smirk. Then Thon opened the door.
So I assume that was your giant eyeball we saw floating around.
Dan asked. Khan smiled as he removed his wet cloak.
Oh, that. A new alteration I learned back east.
How did you find us?
Thon asked.
Well, our advance scouts reported 2 heavily armored fighters riding westward from Torbana. They matched your description and were carving through the undead like butter on their way here. The rest was simple mathematics.
Khan smiled as he approached the fire to warm and dry himself. Dan and Thon were pleased to see a familiar face.
Who do we have for scouts?
Thon asked, eager to hear that some allies were gathering.
James Breen and his daughter Keely, and the other boy, Reese's pupil.
Khan snapped his fingers repeatedly as he hunted through his immense maze of a mind for the name.
Darman? He's still alive?
Thon asked bluntly. Khan nodded.
Yes.
Good.
Thon said, pleasantly surprised.
They are all eager to see you. Both of you. You are needed.
Khan gave them some fresh food and updated them on the state of things over dinner. When Dan learned what transpired between Fergus and Quell, his deep-seated quest to exact his long-sought revenge was reignited. That night, Dan had already began charting his path back to Alinor. When Thon heard that, despite the intense protests of the paladins, I had been allowed to teleport Fergus to the Wood Elf's secret fortress, he was very surprised. But he could understand the thought process. Then Khan told them how, after I disappeared with the Great Seer, neither of us had been seen or heard from since. It had been several weeks. Because Dan and Thon had also not communed with Fergus, they all assumed the worst. That night, Thon began charting his own plans for my capture, or news of my fate. Thebkaru, of course, would be his principal target. Despite being thoroughly impressed by my pluck and touched by my willingness to help the Great Seer, Dan was much more interested in finding Quell than finding me. The truth is, during those many months that we were both unaccounted for, Fergus was recovering peacefully. The druids were able to help him. Trouble is, elvish works of faith tend to be celestial, and a little less immediate than that of human deities and their works. So Fergus's complete convalescence time would be nearly a year. I couldn't report back to Khan and Theos or let Dan or anyone else know what had happened to me, because during that year I had been imprisoned by Nuna and her overzealous Laik. Would-be restorer or not, what I did on my first ever successful teleportation, and with a 200-pound man on my back, mind you, got me in a great deal of trouble with the elves. Some of my less appreciative half-cousins petitioned to have me executed, but the more the druids came to know Fergus and his benevolent works, the less it seemed I would be killed for his deliverance. Over the many months of his recovery, Fergus quite enjoyed his situation and felt almost blessed to be on this quiet, contemplative sabbatical. All things moved much slower within Tel Suma. Fergus entertained the elves with his lovely singing voice and shared many new foods they had never before tasted. Though I rarely saw the light of day, my food rations did get consistently better over time. Finally, Gareth, who incidentally could not handle Nuna, and Theb, who was still my ward, succeeded in arranging for my release the following spring. That's when Fergus came to Torbana and made his sudden initial, unannounced reappearance. But before any of that happened, Dan broke with the others and made his way westward alone, to Alinor, to find and kill Quell, to have his long-awaited revenge.